So I would really now like to introduce Poppy, and thank you for staying with us, Poppy. You're our final speaker of the day. Poppy is the head of cities and regions at Regen, and she's leading Regen's work to support local authorities and responding to various climate emergency issues. Poppy also heads Regen's work on network charging. She joined Regen in August 17 from EDF Energy, so huge organisation, having worked there for 7 years in sustainability, strategy and policy. Poppy's got a first-class degree in economics and politics. We need an environmental economist, Poppy, so this is perfect. And an MA in environmental politics. She's also previously worked for the SDC, the Sustainable Development Commission, and also in equity capital markets at Credit Suisse. So is perfectly placed today to talk about net zero and electricity networks in rural areas. Over to you, Poppy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I hope. And can we just see my screen and not my notes? That's my other question. I'm just going to take that as a yes.
Yeah, we can hear you and see you.
And you can't see my notes, which is good news as well.
No, we can't.
Hi, so thank you for the intro. Yeah, I'm Poppy Maltby. I'm head of cities and regions at Regen. Regen, if you don't know us already, are not-for-profit energy experts. So we work on projects to support our mission, which is to decentralise, decarbonise and democratise energy, and importantly also our energy systems. And I also lead on our local authority memberships and programmes to support local actors in their processes to deliver net zero, so some forums, papers and events and things. But as was introduced, I've also been leading on our engagement with Ofgem on distribution network charging, which is what I'm going to be covering today for the bulk of my presentation. So that sounds a bit dull, but it really is absolutely critical, because what we pay for our electricity network, and particularly what we pay to connect it to it, is really determining how and where it develops around the country. So this basically is the point that the energy infrastructure, particularly the electricity infrastructure, is going to be really fundamental for net zero. I'm just going to hopefully take you to the next slide. Oh, I think can we see that slide on the slideshow? Sorry.
It hasn't moved to the next slide.
It hasn't moved, right. Okay, I'm going to try. Here we go. There we go. So the system at the moment, so we have what is called a shallowish network charge at distribution, and that is the lower voltages, so the ones run by the distribution network operators, and they will be the predominant network in the rural areas. And so all this means is that new connections, so anything, a new demand site, new generation site, like a EV charger or a solar farm, is going to have to pay towards the cost of alleviating any constraints that their new projects might impact or might cause on the network. So it may not cost you very much to connect to the network when it has capacity, in theory, but when it gets full up, the next project wanting to connect faces quite a substantial bill, or is likely to face a substantial bill. And the problem is you get to that point and a lot of projects are relatively unwilling or just unable to pay that cost. And that means essentially a lot of rural areas have sort of reached basically a bit of a gridlock, and any new project is going to have to pay much higher costs than the ones that joined before, and in fact the ones that might join afterwards. So the effect of this essentially is that things don't happen, that business park isn't expanded, that generation site isn't built, and investment can go elsewhere. And I think it raises some really, really big questions about our energy infrastructure essentially, and local governance of that. And Regen have been asking things like, is it really the role of Ofgem and DNOs on their own to decide this and decide what areas have the infrastructure that allows them to develop some of these opportunities for net zero and which don't. So it's a really big, it opens up a really big levelling up question, which is a slightly different conversation, but I thought I'd just touch on that now. So this slide essentially shows a bit of work that Regen did for Dorset earliest this year, and I think it illustrates basically what's happened quite nicely, and I would expect to see similar sort of maps for the rest of the UK and their rural areas. So all these red spots are basically areas of constrained bulk supply points, grid supply points. So these are quite important bits of infrastructure for the electricity network. So basically the bulk of the middle of the country has constraints for both county has constraints for both demand and generation. That includes quite a lot of areas where they might hope to put new generation or new EV chargers, heat pumps, etc. On the right hand side, you've got the urban areas where there is a bit of headroom. You can get some generation in there because you've got a lot of demand and it can absorb generation as a headroom, but unfortunately you don't necessarily have the land for that. And on the other side, you've got very rural areas where actually you've got a bit of demand availability because I guess you've got quite a lot of generation there. So it really does illustrate the problems of achieving net zero and how important that electricity infrastructure is going to be to facilitate that. So the next slide, luckily, gives you a little bit of good news, and this is what I'll be covering in this presentation, is that Ofgem have been actually reviewing these network charges for a number of years, which I've been following. And included in this, they have been particularly looking at the cost to access the distribution network. And they would like to ensure that the cost and the methodology of accessing the distribution network support decarbonisation and contribute to meeting net zero targets, essentially not being a barrier. And they published a Minded 2 decision this summer, big cheering from everybody, which concluded that the way that people currently connect at that level is not conducive to efficient use and development of the distribution network. That's a really important statement, and that the current arrangements basically, as you can sort of see, contribute to DNOs taking an incremental and reactive approach to reinforcement as a way of facilitating new connections rather than investing in the light of anticipated wider network needs. So that really hints at I guess the really big issue with this review is that with net zero, our infrastructure investments really need to be strategic and not incremental. But it's a really big ship to turn. This is going to change significantly the way that things have been done for decades. And in the past, it wasn't really a problem because all we did see was the odd new project coming along, and that was sort of absorbed by the network. It was a slow evolution of needs. But now we're seeing a much larger change, and we really need for it to be most efficient, for that to be a strategic approach. So Ofgem are looking to make a decision on this, hopefully in the spring of next year, and they're hoping they will come in as early as April 2023. So we really hope that these changes happen and that they stick to those timetables. So I'm going to go through a little bit of detail on what those changes are that they're proposing. They're likely to be, well, they are proposing something that is different between demand and generation. And to understand why, I'm going to go a little bit into the detail. I'll try not to get sucked in. There's a lot of detail to go into. But this first slide talks to you about the proposals for demand. So just to understand this whole process, it's quite important to just remember that the electricity network has what we call as voltage levels, and these increase as power needs increase. So our homes are connected to the network at the very lowest voltage level, as we don't use very much as individual, but the network essentially steps up and steps down as needs vary. So a wind farm might be connected at a high voltage level, a really big business at extra high voltage, and some will be connected at transmission, which is the sort of realm of national grid and the whole national network infrastructure. But what we're talking about here is distribution level. So to quickly describe the diagram, what you've got at the top row basically shows you what an existing shallowish charge is to the cost of a new demand connection, which has 4 different elements. It has the cost of your sole use assets. So this is when a new project wants to connect, they have to pay the full cost of the asset that just they are using. So this is the wire or the pipe to get you to the point of connection to the network. You're then going to pay a reinforcement cost at the voltage of your connection. So if you've connected at a low voltage level, any reinforcement cost at that voltage level you will pay a proportion of. You're then also paying the reinforcement costs at 1 voltage level above your connection. So you may also be paying for some reinforcement at a high voltage level. And the final part, which actually doesn't happen very much or at all really at demand, is the transmission attributable work. So you might also trigger something on transmission and then you pay the full cost of that. But I think unless you're some sort of steel work, you're very unlikely to trigger that thing. But essentially there are 4 elements to your charge at the moment. And the minded 2, it shows you along the bottom line, is what they have proposed. And basically what it does is you're going to be paying the full cost of your sole use assets as you usually did, but then the cost of the reinforcement at your voltage level and the voltage level above, which would have been the elements that really brought up that cost for you, will no longer be charged directly to that project. Instead, they're going to be paid by the DNO and then recharged through network charges that we all pay through our bill. So essentially, the costs of those are going to be socialized. So I guess the key points are here that it's likely to deliver cheaper connections for demand in rural areas. So for EV chargers, heat pumps, electrification perhaps of some gas demand that you've already got. So that's good news, but there is a lot of detail to be decided. So we're concerned in Regen particularly about the timing. If you pay for a service, you're often likely to get a clear timetable. If you're not paying for that directly anymore, that timetable is likely to be a bit vaguer, maybe slip. The sole use assets can still be really expensive in a rural area. You're going to have to go a long way potentially to get to the network. And for us, the main concern is just to make sure that this will actually unlock a strategic and cost-effective way to upgrade the network. So that sort of asks the question about what the headroom will be, which is put in. So when they upgrade for, say, an EV charger in a rural area, will they upgrade to allow actually 4 or 5 EV chargers to be connected? And those are the really big wins that we would expect to see in terms of strategic investment, efficiency and cost effectiveness. But on the other side, you've got concerns from Ofgem that they don't want the networks to be building too much underutilised capacity. So there's quite a tussle, we think, in the future between these slightly competing objectives of really wanting to invest for the future and not have too much underutilised capacity. And somehow that's going to have to be resolved. So that talks about demand, but the next slide talks about generation. So this is going to be a little bit different. So you can see the top line is relatively similar to demand at the moment, except it has this extra level of high cost cap, which essentially is if the reinforcement costs get really high at the voltage level or the voltage level above, then the full costs of that reinforcement go directly to the project. So it's a cap, essentially, we need to see it's a cap for the DNO and a cap for the general consumer, but not a cap for the project. So up until a certain point, the costs are shared, and then after that point, the costs are just solely by the project. So it can be quite a significant chunk, and it's likely to be very high. So they're minded to, from April, to have a slightly different approach in that they are thinking of removing the requirement to pay for reinforcement only at the voltage level above connection. So they're retaining the reinforcement cost at the voltage level of connection and keeping it at the level above. And they're also consulting and considering what this high cost cap is going to be for the future, because they still want to essentially dissuade very expensive projects from going ahead, and they think this that might trigger some very expensive reinforcements, and so they want to keep a level of mitigation at that voltage level above. So for essentially, the big difference is that they retain a responsibility for the voltage level reinforcement, and so this basically is slightly less good news for generation. We are cautiously optimistic because it's a step in the right direction and could unlock some schemes, ones that have, I guess, triggered particularly those reinforcement costs at a level above connection. And again, what we really hope for is that the networks then approach this strategically in renewable areas that have significant renewable resource. And if we go back to our sort of bigger question before, we would really like to see these changes unlock a constructive conversation between DNOs and local areas. And ultimately, we would really like there to be some sort of governance role for local areas in being a consultee or part of the process, essentially, in looking at what strategic investment is needed and what electricity infrastructure is going to look like in the future. So just onto my next slide. Oh, sorry, right place. Great. Just to say, there is a lot more going on in network charging than just this change, but I think this is perhaps the most significant one, which is why I focused on it here. So there are other proposals about sort of flexibility, locational network charges, changes to how small generators are going to be paying for the transmission network, which is going to have a potentially very big impact in the north of Scotland in particular. I haven't covered these today, but this document that I'm linking to here does show some of that, the background to that information. So if you're interested to know more about the whole area and to get a little more background into network charging, then do have a look at that. It's a guide that we put together for WPD. Apologies for the coughing. Back in the summer to help communities respond to the consultation. So just to sort of wrap up, I guess, and then I think we should have time to go to some questions. But so the new connections will still need to cover the sole use assets, and these can still be expensive. So although it's good news, be cautiously optimistic about what this might do to rural infrastructure. New demand connections could see, it could be really, really important to constrained areas, and it might reduce that customer cost to connect. And the cost for generation is going to be a little bit more iffy, I guess, and it will depend on that decision about retaining the high cost cap. So a new project, particular worry for us is that a new project could face a lot more uncertainty about how long it might take to connect, because they have sort of less direct control over that particular reinforcement. But within the changes, there was some sort of proposals that new generation projects might be offered something like short-term flexibility and in order to get onto the network ahead of like a wider strategic investment. And so we're really hoping to work with Ofgem to develop what that sort of process might look like and how local areas can have a better role in determining what that looks like. So I've written a number of blogs over on LinkedIn on many of these topics over the years, so do have a look at those and the document if you want to know more about the Ofgem processes. But do be warned, network charging is a big ugly topic, and there's a lot of detail to jump into if you like that sort of thing. So I will end the presentation there and hand back, and hopefully we'll get some questions.
Hey, super. Thank you ever so much, Poppy. I'll certainly check out your LinkedIn pages to try and understand a little bit more. I've learned quite a lot this afternoon from you and Andrew. In particular, I'm still questioning how it could contribute to the levelling up agenda, which is where you started. So that's got my little grey cells working overtime. But really good news about what you were saying about access costs to distribution networks to meet the net zero targets, you know, from Ofgem going forward, and all that around the demand and generation connections. So at least we do have something good to look forward to in energy network. So no, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Poppy.